Hey everyone, it is Christy, and this is a take 2 of reading from my doctoral thesis. I made a video yesterday. Sadly, the sound dropped out a couple times, and so even though it was a half-hour long and it was done fine, there was just too many times that the sound dropped out and I wasn't happy with it, so I'm trying it again with a different mic and also with a lot of other things close. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and screen share, and we're going to pick up from where we left off the last time, which was after the results of testing the comparison of the gendered measures and the sex variable when looking at left-right self-placement of British respondents in my sample. Before I get started, one other thing that I talked about in the video that ended up not going up was that there was a question on the data, and the person had, they had jumped in at about chapter 5 and were unaware of chapter 3 and had asked a question about the data, and that's fine. People can ask questions and I'll direct them to parts of the thesis specifically or say when those are going to come up. However, there is something I think worth mentioning that didn't come up in chapter 3 but is worth noting about the quality of the data set, because it's a very high N, the very high number of observations and cases that I'm working with. The fact is that this data is at least 10 times larger than any other study that has looked at agency and communion from psychology. That is because, and I understand this, people who do psychology at the university level have a lot of things that they want to test. And oftentimes it's survey-based or experimental-based, and they need to pay people for their time. And they also have to recruit, and they have to have a location and computers perhaps to do the, if they're doing some sort of survey, or people who volunteer in order to help them run the studies. And so there's very good methodological reasons for why psychologists and people in psychology have ends of, maybe under 300 or around 200 or something like that, and why they use tests, statistical tests that are appropriate for a smaller N. Difference of means tests and these other types of things. Not to say that they can't do more sophisticated tests, but they just use tests that you don't have to use if you have a large N. And excuse me, in my study, I was able to get, instead of 200 or 300, I have almost 3,000. I have 2,890 respondents in my sample, and so that allows me to do say a lot more about the patterns in the wider British population. So part of the advantage is just the size of the sample. However, if I had just had a sample of almost 3,000 undergraduates from Britain, that obviously wouldn't be nearly as good as having a wide range of respondents, which is what I do have, because we went with YouGov and did the survey through their panel, which I think at the time was around 600,000 people. We were able to get a wide range of responses, people from 18 up until their 70s, different economic classes, different educational backgrounds, different geographical locations around the UK. And this is quite unique for understanding agency and communion in a population, because the number of people participating is much broader than in any of the studies prior to my study. And the final thing is, because you have a broad range of people, when you run the analysis, sometimes if there is a distortion, well, I don't say a distortion, but if certain groups respond at a higher rate in your sample than they do in the general population, then their large size in your sample can kind of skew the data a little bit. So what YouGov do with their data whenever they want to have something nationally representative, or what other social scientists do, is the data has been weighted to be nationally representative. So if, for instance, men responded at a much higher rate in the sample than women did, let's say hypothetically that men made up 52% of my sample's data set, whereas in the population, let's say hypothetically, they make up 49%. When the calculations are analyzed, those men's answers would be sort of proportionally reduced in order to accurately represent their position in the population so they don't distort the data. So not only is the data set 10 times larger than anything used previously in psychology, and not only is it more representative in terms of it actually having a wide range of adults from the general population who have participated, it's also weighted to be nationally representative. So these are all things in favor of the robustness of the findings and the confidence that we can have that they're measuring something that's happening in the population that needs to be replicated again. So since I can't remember the person who asked me the question about the data, but it did inspire me to explain that, because again, it doesn't come up in chapter 3, and I think it is worth describing the benefits of my approach in that way, because of the confidence and the robustness that we can have that there's something going on in the actual population based on the results of this analysis. Moving on to what we're going to evaluate this time in terms of traditional left-right political attitudes as have been historically measured in political science, especially in this case, British political science. We've done the left-right self-placement on a numerical/adjectival scale, and now we're going to be looking at the results of analysis when using the socialist laissez-faire scale and the libertarian authoritarian scale developed for British political science. Sorry, I'm just going to pause here to clear my throat, and I'll turn off the mic when I do that, because obviously that's not very pleasant to listen to. So just 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Socialist laissez-faire and libertarian authoritarian. Anthony Heath, Jeffrey Evans, and Jean Martin developed measures for attitudes which they termed as core belief and values, namely measures of socialism laissez-faire and libertarian authoritarian attitudes. The authors cite Rocheik's argument that variation in political ideology can be reduced to that. When stripped to their barest essence, these variations are characterized by opposing views of the desirability of freedom and equality. The authors also cite Fleischmann's evidence that a two-dimensional and uncorrelated model can adequately describe the structure of social attitudes. To develop and evaluate short scales designed to capture the economic welfare dimension, the socialist laissez-faire, and the individual liberty scale, authoritarian libertarian scale, Heath et al. Worked with data from a nationally representative sample made up of panel members drawn from the 1989 British Social Attitude Survey. First, I present the results for the socialist laissez-faire scale of Heath et al., followed by the scale analysis results of these measures in the exploratory dataset, and finally by the regression analysis. I provide the details and analysis of the libertarian authoritarian scale in the second section. The goal of the socialist laissez-faire measures was to capture the conceptual components related to equality, collectivism, and government intervention. They used 6 items to form their socialist laissez-faire scale, which produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.64. Their confirmatory factor analysis produced a single factor loading for the measures. In our survey, we included 3 of these measures and asked respondents to indicate whether they strongly agreed, neither agreed nor disagreed, or strongly disagreed with the following statements. And just to break from reading here, these are exactly what had been asked in British election studies going back for about 20 years now. 1. Ordinary working people get their fair share of the nation's wealth. 2. There is no need for strong trade unions to protect employees' working conditions and wages. 3. Private enterprise is the best way to solve Britain's economic problems. In our dataset, the measures produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.63, which exceeds the 0.5 alpha as recommended by Pallant. Principal components analysis using a direct Obermann rotation, missing cases deleted listwise, produced a single factor solution. This variable was saved and used as the dependent variable in the ordinary least squares analysis below. As Model 1 in Table 5.4 indicates, the overall variance explained by the socio-demographic model is low, with an adjusted R-square of 0.04. Due to the coding of the scales, where strongly agree was coded as 1 and strongly disagree was coded as 5, a negative coefficient indicates the variable is associated with laissez-faire attitudes and a positive coefficient is associated with a more socialist outlook. Two variables are associated with a greater likelihood of holding socialist attitudes. Being a female, beta equals 0.09, and living in the north, beta equals 0.05. In Model 1, the sex variable has the largest beta coefficient of all the variables. The other variables, which produced similarly high betas, higher incomes and having a mortgage, were associated with support of free markets, beta equals negative 0.08 for both measures. So having a higher status job is associated with free market principles, beta equals negative 0.06, as was being older, beta equals negative 0.05, and being a self-identified Christian, beta equals negative 0.05. Adding gender measures to the model, Model 2, doubles the variance explained to 8% and renders both the sex and age variables insignificant. Instead of the sex variable producing the largest beta, communion has the largest beta, 0.16, and agency has the second largest beta, negative 0.12, in the expanded socio-demographic model. Both of these gender measures produce statistically significant coefficients in the directions predicted by H6 and H7. I think I'm going to break this here just to kind of go over the analysis, because we're moving on now to libertarian, authoritarian, and you haven't really seen the numbers yet. So first is the principal components analysis, the component matrix for the socialist laissez-faire measures. As you see, when you put them into a statistical package and you run PCA, what you find is that the answers that people give correlate very highly in the single dimension, which indicates to someone interpreting these results that these measures are measuring the same latent variable, because you can't measure socialist views directly, or if you ask people if they're a socialist, that's not a good way to measure whether or not they are a socialist, because of social desirability and the way that the term is understood in the community or the society over a given period of time. So we use these questions that measure elements of the socialist laissez-faire dimension without actually asking people directly, because they're going to give us responses that we can't always rely on because of their social desirability or their understanding of what the term means in terms of how the political science, people who are doing the analysis have done it. So we have a single factor loading, and when you run a regression analysis, in this case ordinary least squares regression on it, if we were to run a traditional political science model with demographic variables, it would appear that there is a massive sex difference. Well, not a massive sex difference, but yeah, actually, in terms of what's driving the variation here, you can see, if you remember from my video on statistics, the point of a beta is to tell you which variable is having the most influence in terms of explaining the variance in the dependent variable. And you eliminate the plus or minus signs and you just put them in rank order. So obviously here, the sex variable in this model has the biggest beta. This would make it appear as if there is a sex difference between the male and female respondents in the sample. However, when you control for how agentic a person is or how communal they are, what you find is that it's actually those gendered attitudes and people's score on that are really explaining the variation in the socialist laissez-faire variable. So you can see here, we've seen an improvement in the R-squared, almost doubling because of adding these three variables. And that sex becomes insignificant. And again, the reason why this is important is because it is another piece of evidence that demonstrates that when we are picking up a sex difference in our data in British political science and potentially in other countries as well, it looks like men and women are different. However, what is really driving it, at least in this model, is how agentic a person feels, regardless of if they're a man or a woman, and how communal a person is, regardless, again, whether or not they are a man or a woman. The fact that sex is significant here is just picking up on the fact that more men score higher on agency and more women score higher on communion. So what this is, the sex variable, I would argue, and we're going to see more evidence of this, is like sort of epiphenomenal. It's picking up on something that's not, it's not transitory, so it's not entirely a perfect term here. But when we're picking up on this variation that we're attributing to the male-female distinction, what we're missing is that there's actually a value and a norms distinction here that is more important than a biological sex explanation to account for people's variation in their preferences on socialist laissez-faire issues. So that is another piece of evidence that is in support of the hypotheses that we're looking to test. Moving back to the document. In their work, 6 items were used to form Heath et al.'s libertarian authoritarian scale. Their analysis produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.53, and their confirmatory factor analysis suggested that a single factor loading. In addition to the traditional measures developed by Heath et al., we included some new measures of libertarian authoritarian attitudes developed by Mehrabian into the questionnaire for the first testing wave. Based on the performance of these measures in the testing wave, the main questionnaire respondents were asked to indicate whether they strongly agreed to strongly disagreed with the following statements. And again, these are coming from a tested series of questions battery that had been published by Mehrabian, as well as the traditional long-term socialist libertarian authoritarian scales from British political science. So, 1, young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values. 2, censorship of films and magazines is necessary to uphold moral values. 3, people should be allowed to organize public meetings to protest against the government. 4, people in Britain should be more tolerant of those who lead unconventional lives. 5, even political parties that wish to overthrow democracy should not be banned. 6, we need a strong government to create a better society. 7, I am willing to exchange my personal freedoms for greater security provided by government programs. 8, people who break the law should get stiffer sentences. Again, when you do a principal components analysis and evaluate the response patterns for these 8 questions, as I will be describing in the text, what you get instead of a single factor loading, which is what we saw here with the measure of socialist laissez faire, a single component where all of the questions loaded on a single dimension showing that they were measuring the same thing. Here we see that they've broken up into 2 components. So we would, as political scientists and other people who would do this sort of work, would then separate out, and that's what I did, separate out the questions that are in a second component, and you can deal with those separately, and then reduce the scale from 8 down to 5 in order to capture this one component. So just to review here, the component that's number 1 is loaded with the question about people don't have enough respect, that censorship in magazines is necessary to, uphold moral values, that these people would be more likely, to agree that you need a strong government to create a better society, willing to exchange personal freedoms for greater security, and people who break the law should get stiffer sentences. These are the elements that hang together. And then you've got a separate component here, which is people should be allowed to organize public meetings, people in Britain should be more tolerant of those who lead unconventional lifestyles, and even political parties that wish to overthrow democracy should not be banned. And that's the second component. So what we would not want to do is put all these together and say they're measuring the same thing, because our factor analysis shows that there are 2 elements of these questions here that are quite distinct in their response patterns. Our measures for the, this should be libertarian authoritarian scale, produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.37, which was significantly lower than the results for Heath et al. Principal components analysis using a direct Obermann rotation was conducted on these measures, and the results, table 5.5, indicate the 2-factor components. Again, that's what we just covered. This time the scale analysis for the 5-question scale produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.64. The results for the 3-question scale produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.44. As noted in Chapter 3, Pallant recommends a Cronbach's alpha of 0.5 on scales of fewer than 10 items. However, it is common to find low Cronbach's alpha with small scales. An alternative evaluative measure was recommended by Briggs and Cheek, who recommended an inter-item correlation range of between 0.2 and 0.4. The inter-item correlations for the 3 items ranged from between 0.18 and 0.24. Based upon these results, the 3 questions on factor 2 were removed, and only the 5-item libertarian authoritarian factor variable was analyzed with ordinary least squares regression. The results of Model 1 and Model 2 are displayed in Table 5.6. In Model 1, the socio-demographic model accounts for 11% of the variance explained. In Model 2, the addition of the gender measures has a negligible effect, raising the adjusted R-squared from 0.11 to 0.13. Due to the way the responses are coded, a negative coefficient indicates the variable is associated with authoritarian views, and a positive coefficient is associated with a liberal outlook on the questions listed above. In both models 1 and 2, higher education produces a liberalizing effect and produces the largest beta, 0.20 in both models. Self-identifying as a Christian is associated with authoritarian views and has the second largest beta coefficient in both models, negative 0.14 in Model 1 and negative 0.13 in Model 2. Sex is significant in both models, with women being more authoritarian than men even when controlling for an individual's gender score. In Model 2, the agency variable was not statistically significant, evidence against H6. The communion measure was statistically significant and associated with a more liberal outlook, which is evidence for H7, and its beta was tied for second largest with the measure for Christian self-identification, negative 0.13. In Model 2, the emotional vulnerability variable was also statistically significant and associated with a more authoritarian outlook, beta equals negative 0.05, a result in line with the results of Chapter 4, which indicated that emotional vulnerability was associated with indicating the respondent would vote for the right-leaning Conservative Party. Again, going over the data here, we can see from the betas that in the previous model here, if we put these in rank order again, ignoring the sign of the coefficient, you have age left school, so education, and then Christian down here. Then you have the sex variable, income, parent, and being married. These are the ones that are all in operation in terms of the socio-demographic model. When you include the measures of the gendered measures, you can see that what happens is education is still the most important explanatory variable. Now a self-identified Christian is tied with communion as moving people over to a more authoritarian position, which is the negative position. And then you have other variables that remain pretty stable. You've got married is pretty stable, and then it stays close to the same amount. The size of the beta is the same here also for income. So what this tells us is that sex and gender, it's not enough to just include measures of agency and communion and suddenly you're going to explain all of the variance that used to be explained by the sex variable, which is what we saw in this table, and we're going to be looking at how sex is made insignificant in second variables in other locations as well. But what it does tell us is that there is still some variance that is explained, that is a difference between men and women that is above and beyond the differences that we can already account for by using the gendered measures. So it's not, as I said, just the case that because you have a measure of agency and communion, one can make the sex variable just go away in every single instance. That would have been an interesting finding, but life is way more complicated than that, and data is often more complicated than that. So we have here the communion is in support of the predicted hypothesis, and then the other one, agency, is not. So we're going to move on to equality and kindness. And then I think we're going to leave it off because after we get through equality and kindness, sorry, just one second. The next section has to do with voting, and we move from ordinary least squares regression into logistic regression. And I think it just makes a bit more sense to keep all of the interpretations together in a 20-minute video, within one method, because I can then explain next time about the odds and how a logistic regression talks about the likelihood rather than measuring the change in a dependent variable given a one-unit change in the independent variable. Equality and kindness. So far, this chapter has examined the relationship between common measures of political attitudes and measures of gender. In the next section, I will review the results of analyses on 2 additional scales that were included in the dataset. The next 2 dependent variables have been labeled equality and kindness. These measures were derived from the work of Feldman and Steenbergen using American data collected with random digit dialing from areas in and around Long Island, Brooklyn, and Queens, New York. Their number of cases was between 281 and 293. The researchers tested 8 measures of egalitarianism, labeled here as equality. In their analysis, Feldman and Steenbergen's egalitarianism scale produced a reliability score of Cronbach's A alpha equals 0.76. For the measure of humanitarianism, labeled here as kindness, their 8 scale items produce a score of Cronbach's alpha equals 0.69. Our survey used a subset of 3 questions from the 2 sets of 8 questions used by Feldman and Steenbergen. Given the space constraints, we selected 3 questions from each of the 2 scales. As with the previous measures, respondents were asked to indicate whether they strongly agreed to strongly disagreed. The equality scale statements used in the dataset were: 1. Our society should do whatever necessary to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. 2. One of the big problems in this country is that we don't give everyone an equal chance. 3. If people were treated more equally in this country, we would have many fewer problems. Statements for the kindness scale were: one of the problems of today's society is that we are often too kind to people who don't deserve it. 2. It is best not to get too involved in taking care of other people's needs. 3. People tend to pay more attention to the well-being of others than they should. According to Pallant, the recommended score on the Cronbach's alpha coefficient should be equal to or higher than 0.5 for a scale composed of less than 10 items. The value of Cronbach's alpha for the equality scale in the main Internet survey questionnaire was alpha equals 0.81, while analysis of the kindness scale from the Internet survey produced a Cronbach's alpha of 0.69. Both alphas were higher than the recommended score of 0.5. Principal components analysis was conducted on the 2 scales using a direct Oberlin rotation, missing cases deleted listwise. A 2-factor solution was produced with each of the scales loading onto their own factors. The results of the pattern and structure matrices are displayed below in tables 5.7. These results were saved as regression variables and were used as the dependent variables in the ordinary least squares analysis below. As with the other regression analyses conducted in this and previous chapters, the variables were checked for normality of distribution, outliers, heteroscedasticity, and multicollinearity, and no problems were found. Table 5.8 shows the results of the socio-demographic model on the factor variable for the equality scale. As with the previous models, only a small amount of the variance is explained, 5%. Due to the way the measures are coded, 1 equals strongly agree and 5 equals strongly disagree, the negative coefficients indicate the variable is associated with egalitarianism, and positive coefficients indicate the variable is associated with a more tolerant attitude regarding disparity and equality. In Model 1, the higher scores, I'm going to pause on before we go that just to walk you through the structure matrix here. And what you have is we've seen, that when we want to evaluate whether or not questions are hanging together insofar as they're measuring the same concept, principal components analysis is a good way to explore this. And when you put all 6 questions into a factor analysis, they load very clearly onto 2 different components. And the first one, you could say all of the bolded ones in component 1 that are 0.75, 0.89, 0.89. These are the levels at which they're sort of correlating or hanging together, which is very distinct from the 0.05, 0.13, and the 0.19. So you can see that cutoff point shows a very clear distinction. And we see the same thing with the kindness scale, which have scores of 0.81, 0.84, 0.70. So these are 6 sets of questions that are measuring 2 distinct latent constructs or latent variables. In Model 1, the higher scores on the economic socio-demographic variables are associated with tolerance of inequality, with income producing the largest beta at 0.11, followed by home ownership, beta equals 0.10. More egalitarian views are associated with being older, being female, and being a parent. Adding the gender variable modestly improves the fit of the model, adjusted R-squared 0.07, and has the effect of making the sex variable insignificant. In Model 2, the communion and agency measures produce robust betas relative to the other variables included in the model, beta equals negative 0.10 and 0.09 respectively, and both measures are in the predicted directions. This result provides more evidence in support of H6 and H7. Finally, the measures of emotional vulnerability is also statistically significant and is associated with egalitarian attitudes, beta equals negative 0.05. OLS regression on the kindness factor variable produces a low amount of variance explained. The adjusted R-square for Model 1 is 0.06. Due to the way the variables were coded in this model, a negative coefficient indicates the variable is associated with attitudes that regard kindness as important, and positive coefficients are associated with affirmative attitudes toward principles of kindness. According to Model 1, higher levels of education are associated with affirmative attitudes toward kindness. Moreover, this measure has the largest beta coefficient, beta equals 0.18. The next largest beta is associated with being female, beta equals 0.11. Following these two variables, there is then a drop-off in terms of the beta size, with several other variables producing beta coefficients which range between 0.04 and 0.07. In Model 2, the inclusion of measures of gender does not render the sex variable insignificant. Women had a higher score on the kindness scale than men, even controlling for the explanatory effects of gendered perspectives. However, the inclusion of gender measures, and in particular measures for communion, overtakes the sex variable in terms of how much of the explanation it can account for. Education still produces the largest beta, but communion has the second highest beta in the socio-demographic model, 0.14. Sorry, the education beta was 0.19. Sex and agency measures are both within a second group of explanatory variables which have beta coefficients ranging from between plus and minus 0.04 and 0.07. Emotional vulnerability is not statistically significant in this analysis, and these results provide support for H6 and H7. First, let's look at the equality scale, and this is what I mean to say when it's not like putting in agency and communion produce a consistent effect. Things are like life is always more complicated than that. So what we have here, as you can see, is that there was a difference. It wasn't the biggest beta. In fact, it was tied with parenthood for being the lowest one in terms of the rank order of the betas in Model 1. But when you control for agency and communion, again, sex becomes statistically insignificant. So it's not the case that women are more in favor of equality and men are more in favor of tolerating inequality. It is the case, based on this, that when you put agency and communion into a model, the variance that had previously been picked up by the sex variable is now fully accounted for by agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability. And in fact, communion here now ties age in years as the highest ranked beta. Oh, sorry, there's a couple here. Income and mortgage as well. So communion is performing right up there with really powerful control variables in terms of, if you have more money, you're probably more likely to be, intolerant of poor people or inequality. If you have a mortgage, your score is going to be more associated with tolerating inequality. And as you get older, there's a trend to becoming more egalitarian, whereas people in their younger years seem to be more tolerant of inequality. So this is how the data worked out in my data set, and as I have concluded before, we can see that the sex variable variation is accounted for fully by including agency and communion. But life is not that simple. So here is Model 1 on the kindness factor, and even when you control for agency and communion, the effect of being female is still statistically significant, and fairly highly statistically significant at that. This is not near 0.5, it's near 0.001. That doesn't really tell you anything about the strength of it, just how confident we are that it's not an aberration, that it actually would be a real thing in the data set. We can also see that after age left school, you get communion now as the second most important beta, or the second largest beta, and that's because it's positive. It's in the direction of kindness being important. And then you also have agency, which has the negative impact on the dependent variable, but it's kind of clustered around all of the other ones. So you can, in terms of breaking, let's say 10% mark, or 0.10 agency, communion and age left school are really driving what that small amount of 8% of variation that's being explained. The next thing is partisanship, and as I said, I think it's probably best to stop here because, one, I'm trying to keep these videos to 20 minutes, and I suspect I've already gone over that by quite a bit, and also because we're going to move from an ordinary least squares regression into a logistic regression, and I think it's just easier to package methods together rather than in case people walk out of the room and come back in and suddenly I'm not describing, I'm talking about likelihoods rather than changes in the dependent variable. So that's it. I'm going to have a quick look here. I'm going to go through the partisanship section, see how long it is. Yeah, so we're going to have a little bit to go through here. We've got labor and conservative, and then we have the conclusion, where I go through all of the various hypotheses that are coming out of this and look at the patterns of the results and look at the overall story. And from this chapter, like I said, I'm going to skip chapter 6 and we're going to go right on to the conclusion, which is not filled with statistics. For people who find that stuff boring, you'll be very happy with that. But it does tie together everything that I've been setting up from the introduction forward. So it's a very important chapter that not only does an overview of the results of the findings as I presented them, but also looks ahead and tries to examine the implications of the way that the data worked out and the hypothesis testing and whatnot. That is what you have to look forward to. So I guess I will be providing more information. I can stop sharing now. I'll continue this on. I'm hoping to finish it up this week because, again, we only have one section with the logistic regression and the conclusion, and then the conclusion to the thesis. For those of you who have to do a thesis sometime, I hope this gives you an idea of the scope of what your work might entail. And also, as I've often said, that I wanted this to be a demonstration of the value of feminist critique, because it is specifically by bringing the question, what do you mean by gender, and trying to better and more accurately gender the concept of how we attribute a causal structure to social norms or social identities or other things that are currently being picked up by the sex variable. I think, as I've demonstrated in just this one section, that times that we think sex is statistically significant in our analyses, we might be wrong. And so the impact of sex differences as measured by a biological category might be overstated in at least British political science, or it might only appear in certain situations, like views on authoritarian libertarianism or views on equality. So yeah, what this investigation has produced is trying to better understand where the variation is coming from in order to have a better survey instrument, in order to have better and more accurate results, so that we can be more precise in our description of the empirical world, which is what science is. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. You're such a nerd if you've made it this far. I appreciate you. I think you're awesome for your nerdiness. So until next time, I've been Christy, you've been awesome, and I'll talk to you later. Bye!